Hi, I'm going to go over the directions for our first discussion assignment here, calling this here the death argument. You can see there's two parts, A and B below. Notice that part A is coming up soon, so I want to encourage everybody to get in there and just make your contribution. That's all it really is. So let me just quickly go over the directions, and then I'll look at the argument itself for a bit. This will give you a little background and a little kind of specific things that you can use to get your submission in. Okay, so submit this part as a new thread in the forum. That's the kind of thing at the bottom of the page. And, type something up on your own, 100 to 250 words. Just copy and paste it into a new thread. Then for part B, this will be a little bit later, you're going to be going and replying to some of the threads that the other students have left. So that's why there's two parts to this. You're going to put in a bunch of new threads. Then you're going to go back and reply to some of the new threads your peers have posted. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Part A. The first part of this is really the main thing. It's the kind of the nuts and the bolts of it. The second, third, and fourth parts there, those are just adding a little something around this. Really, I'm just asking you to evaluate the persuasiveness of the argument that's laid out below. That's the kind of most common thing that we'll be doing here in critical thinking, and really all throughout the course. We're going to be evaluating arguments. Everything kind of feeds back to that main thing. So I wanted to start off with an argument evaluation for us. That's what we've got here. So important to just see that what I'm asking you to do is essentially just that, the basic process of argument evaluation. So I'm asking you how ultimately, or how persuasive or unpersuasive do you find this reconstruction of an argument from Socrates that I've laid out below? So I'm calling this Socrates' death argument. This is taken right from the very end of the famous dialogue Apology, which is very central to our text, and all of the stuff about Socrates that we'll be looking at is the famous dialogue Apology. That's his actual trial. And at the very end, he gives this well-known reflection and essentially an argument about death, which he is now facing. So how should I feel about this death, which now awaits me, Socrates, because I've now just received my death sentence from the court, literally. So he's going to reflect on, what is the kind of philosophically appropriate attitude to have towards his own death. And we can kind of use that as an analogy for what any of us might think about death. So I've crystallized an argument that's present in those few steps below, and this should be, if it's a good argument, logically convincing, and it should also be proceeding from factually or objectively solid considerations. So I'm essentially just asking you to evaluate that. Do you think that this argument is proceeding in a logical manner? And is it beginning from factually or objectively legitimate assumptions or premises? Is it really well supported by the evidence? And is it involving good reasoning? So those are really the two kind of questions to ask yourself when you're looking at saying how persuasive or unpersuasive you find this argument. Is really could be boiled down to those two things. Is the reasoning involved logical? Is it coherent? And is it beginning from and working with factually or objectively solid considerations to begin with, their initial premises or evidence? So there's lots of complicated topics that come up in thinking about this argument, but this is what I want to emphasize. Your evaluation of it as an argument really just boils down to those two things I just mentioned. The quality of the inference and the reasoning, and the qualities of the premises that are being used to begin with. As we'll see, that's kind of all throughout critical thinking. The many different things that are included in that really come down to those two broad categories. There's lots of ways to do either of those two things, so there's a lot of different ways that you can assess the persuasiveness of this argument. So it's important to say I'm not looking for any specific answer. There's no right or wrong way to go. There's lots of interesting debates to be had about this argument when we scrutinize it and start asking questions. That leads us to lots of other issues, and those will be interesting philosophical questions of their own that contain other arguments. And that's really the point of asking you to get into this argument, is that it gets into lots of interesting web of other kinds of arguments and considerations. And now we're really involved in a rich critical thinking space. So I want you to kind of be getting, into like all of the complex issues that this, simple looking argument really involves, right? So it's going to be a lot more complicated than just these few claims. So let me just pull back for a sec. Pull back and just ask yourself, what seems kind of convincing about this argument and what doesn't seem very convincing about this argument. And as the saying goes, kind of follow your nose. Just see where does that lead you in terms of some very specific kind of critique or question or possibly criticism that might lead you to. So I'm going to kind of leave that here because I want this to be pretty open. This is our first round looking at arguments and evaluating them. So I want you to start by following your own instinct, so to speak. But I've been trying here to kind of emphasize what kind of instinct to be looking for in yourself. I want it to be kind of a logical one, logical instincts, and follow those. Where do your logical instincts lead you when you're kind of poking around this argument? Okay, so let me just finish this. And just add here, do this by explaining which specific aspects of the argument you find most persuasive and which are most problematic. So there I'm really just kind of giving you a signal, be specific in terms of pointing to some, to the use of this word, or it was this phrase, or is this particular thing in the argument, right? So that means that your critique is always grounded in something in the argument itself, and that's something that we also want to be doing. So say what it is specifically, not your general feeling, for sure, or even generalities about the argument, but begin with the argument itself. This premise, if nothing else, you can state which of the statements is the one that you really want to take into further consideration here. Okay, so just be specific about something in the argument. This next step here, consider some improved formulation or improved version of at least one of the claims in the argument that could improve the argument as a whole. Okay, so basically think of a small improvement that you could think of that might give it a little extra strength. This is sometimes what we call a principle of charity, or kind of a principle of charitable reconstruction of an opponent's argument. For this reason, we want to kind of take it as just as it stands at face value. That's mostly what we're doing here in this class, and not relying on like, oh, what you meant to say or things like that. But what we really want to know is there a good argument to be had here, even if the one in front of us is a little bit off? In this way, maybe there's just a small fix that we can make, and oh wow, now this is looking like a much better argument. So if you can think of those kinds of improvements to really any argument, that's always a really valuable kind of critical thinking and really life resource to be able to have that kind of capacity. Because sometimes small mistakes can be easily improved for quite a considerable gain. So if you see something here where you're like, well, maybe if you just kind of put it this way, or you adjusted the argument that way, this might actually be a more kind of plausible or stronger argument. Here, just asking you to look for something like that. If you really can't find anything that's not that big of a deal, it's kind of a smallish part of it. Really, most is just kind of explaining the first part here. And then I say here, finally explain whether you ultimately believe it's rational or irrational, da-da-da-da. So here I'm kind of really just looking for you to kind of bring your reflection on the topic in general to a close. I've first asked you to look at something very specific and detailed in the argument to kind of pick on or to talk about. And now at the end, just kind of pull back, what is your ultimate thought on the topic now, which really is, how should I feel about my own death? And I'll say a little something more about that very idea below. So that's really what I'm looking for you to do here. Pretty general. Most of that is contained in the first step there, just kind of getting into the bases for your belief that the argument is persuasive in these ways and unpersuasive in those, and really just kind of getting out reasons. That's the most important thing. You're kind of getting there. Good kind of logical reasons. They don't have to be the ultimate decisive reasons, just relevant reasons that should be entered into the full debate and discussion, right? So that's kind of what the first part asks you to do. The rest of it is just kind of like putting on some finishing details and context around that. And I finish by asking you to make an interesting subject line. So that's really a request, and who knows what's interesting. But just so that really the forum doesn't look like it's just a bunch of posts that say discussion number 1. It just doesn't like meet the eye that well. Okay, so let me just briefly say something about part 2. As you can see, this is due a few days later, so you're going to have to go back and take a look at some other people's posts, and presumably they've done some version of what you just did above, and I'm going to kind of hold off on going too far into this, but basically just giving a kind of logical comparison of your response to the argument and their response to the argument, and now you've got kind of 2 logical responses to that one argument in front of you, and now you can start kind of comparing various logical ways of responding to the argument. And that's really what this is asking you to do, because there's always nuances of other logical perspectives that will be different from ours and will bring out slightly different aspects of these multifaceted issues. So it's good to take a close look at other rational ways of responding to the same topic or argument. Alrighty, so go back in there and let me say in terms of broad issues about how to submit this or what it should look like, none of that really matters. This is like kind of a discussion as if we were having a discussion in class, and maybe you raised your hand with some prepared remarks. Imagine you showed up to class with some kind of, prepared remarks, and you were, discussing with the rest of us, and it was informed by some thought and reflection, but it doesn't matter that it's in this format, MLA, APA, none of that matters. This is just separate different thoughts by separate paragraphs, as you would with any kind of attempt to communicate clearly. So all I want you to do is to clearly communicate your thoughts. There's no kind of number of sentences per paragraph, number of paragraphs, whatever it takes to clearly communicate your ideas around the broad guidelines given is fine. I'm not looking for any kind of formatting or none of that kind of stuff matters. I think of that as pretty much, that's easy stuff that I wouldn't really test in a class like this, because we're testing critical thinking, not like formatting skills. So don't worry about formatting skills, and definitely don't let that hold you back from actually thinking and doing the assignment, worrying about what the format should look like. It doesn't matter. Okay, so I've got a word count there, and I'm going to go on to a little discussion of the argument itself, and hopefully this will give you a little encouragement and a little direction for how to get in there and do it. All right, we're going to take a quick look here at what I call the death argument. This is my reconstruction of Socrates' argument towards the end of the Apology. So let me say, broadly speaking, this argument brings together in a certain logical way 2 broad concepts, namely death and fear. As you can see, those are the kind of 2 main themes that this argument weaves together with a little logic and a couple additional assumptions to bring these concepts, death and fear, together, specifically to get us to the conclusion at 4 below that it would be irrational to fear your own death. So I've added a couple little things to fear and death, like the concept of irrationality, and I guess the specification that the death in question is one's own. So that's the kind of package of concepts that we're kind of logically tying together here in this argument. That's what the argument is aiming to do, to identify and spell out the logical connections that we can see between those concepts sufficient to get us to that conclusion 4, number 4 then. So let's look at the details here a little bit. The first premise states that death is either of 2 things, what I'm calling AOC, annihilation of consciousness, or ROS, relocation of the soul. I'm just giving those acronyms to each of these two things that death is said to potentially be here. Let me say just briefly, by annihilation of consciousness, it's kind of a stark way of just saying the absence of consciousness, but in particular yours, right? It's the annihilation of whoever's death is in question. Their death means the absence of their consciousness, not some change in their body ultimately, but really it's what goes is consciousness, all of it. So there's no consciousness left, the pulling of the plug, so to speak, right? So death could be that, or as I say here, a relocation of the soul, and that could be something like going to heaven or hell. It could be reincarnation. It might be any number of ways of the soul relocating, so that might happen in lots of different ways. But that would be another thing that death could be. All right, well, that certainly seems like two options for what death could be. We might want, critical clarity on what either of these two ways of death being. What does that really amount to? That's one kind of logical question we can start answering, is kind of requests for precision and clarity of AOC and ROS, something like that. Another question, of course, is death only just these two possible things, or is there a third thing that death could be? That would be, I think, a more devastating concern for the argument if it kind of clearly overlooks a third thing that death might be. That really does kind of pose a problem for the logic of the argument. For my part, it's, I don't know, I could say it's kind of plausible to actually say whatever death is, maybe it really does boil down to one or other of these two things. But I'll leave it to you. Think maybe there's something that doesn't fit into either category, way of kind of thinking of what death might be. And here I'm actually thinking of the Robert Nozick book, Chapter 2 on dying, for this reason. This is one of our texts, is that Nozick kind of puts out there lots of different possibilities. Some of them are kind of far-flung about what death might be. And you can see in the chapter, it's a short little chapter, but he does that. And there we could even think, well, I wonder if any of those are either, like, do all of those fit into these two categories? Or are one of those a third category that Nozick happens to mention? So that's just kind of a little commentary on the kind of things that you might think by way of analysis, evaluating this argument about the first statement there. But it's introducing these two different things that death could be. Going to number 2, now we're looking at like the annihilation possibility specifically. Let's assume it was the first of these two things. Thus, if death is annihilation, the argument goes on to say, it is irrational to fear being dead because it would be impossible to experience any harm once your consciousness is annihilated, which we're assuming is what it means, what happens when you're dead. And this is a pretty big new additional claim here where we're bringing in fear. Now we're doing psychology. It only makes sense to fear something if it could harm you. So now we're tying death under this particular conception of annihilation of consciousness to this psychological concept of fear. And now we're really starting to make an argument. Now we're getting fear and death together, so to speak. Once we bring in this idea of it being what it does or doesn't make sense to fear. You see, like down below, in number 4, the argument concludes about irrationality, something being irrational or not. The way I put it up here is what does or doesn't make sense in statement number 2. So, I don't know, you can think, are those kind of synonymous enough phrases that we can kind of use irrationality to cover what's being discussed in premise 2, or are those different things? A little nitpicky kind of thing you could look at. But really you want to get behind this idea that if we were to assume the annihilationist view of death, that you wouldn't have any possibility of being harmed. Death couldn't bring you any harm. Being dead couldn't harm you, I guess, if you're not there in any way at all. This is what we're saying if your consciousness is annihilated. But I guess maybe probably most substantively, I'm just kind of like, looking at what jumps out at me. I think this idea of what it does and doesn't make sense to fear. That's a pretty clear thing that you could really grab onto in terms of argument evaluation. And does that claim, what is that? Does that claim really hold up? Are there any general criteria for what we should or shouldn't fear? Or is that something where there's not really a rational basis to determine what we should or shouldn't fear? That seems certainly to be one substantive assumption of this argument, is that there's kind of rational bases for fearing and not fearing things, and really the claim is that death is violating these rational bases for what we should and shouldn't fear, and we're being given an argument for that in statement number 2. So maybe the interesting part of this kind of looks at the criteria for rational and irrationally fearing things, and what do we ultimately want to say about that? Is the state of being dead, when seen as the annihilation of your own consciousness, something that really is irrational to fear, or not? I mean, maybe there's good reasons actually to fear the annihilation of your own consciousness. So that seems to kind of open up a pretty interesting range of concepts and ideas to explore on the kind of what's rational to fear side of the argument, because there's a very decided assumption this argument makes about what is or isn't rational to fear, and to an extent that's kind of lurking in the background of the argument. We might say there's kind of hidden assumptions about some specific idea of what is rational and irrational to fear that we need to look more closely at, and these need to be defended if this argument is ultimately defensible. So that's kind of certainly one clear path that you could take in premise 2. But I want to leave that open. There's lots of different spaces to raise critical questions all along the way. So let's look at number 3. If death is a relocation of the soul, then one can continue to engage with other minds and souls in philosophical discussion after the death of the body, and this is to be welcomed rather than feared. So this is fairly specific to how Socrates describes the case when he says, well, should my soul go to the underworld in Hades, as we're told, I could essentially converse on philosophical matters with the souls of the underworld, and this is the activity that gives my life meaning and purpose, as I'm doing here on earth. That's the life-fulfilling kind of activity that I engage in, and that's the kind of thing that I can continue to do even if I were to lose this physical form of the body and to exist solely as a spirit or soul. I could still engage in the meaning-giving activities of me, Socrates, in my life. So that isn't something to fear. Rather, that's something to embrace, just as I embrace the opportunity to engage in philosophical inquiry with my peers here on earth in ancient Greece, as it were for Socrates. So that's a fairly specific thing that Socrates says for why he shouldn't fear it. I guess he kind of really needs to give the rest of us a reason for thinking that the continuation of our soul is something to embrace, and rather than something to fear. I think that's what really ultimately number 3 needs to establish that. And well, I guess that's an open question, and whether we would have as much reason to embrace the continuation of our soul, if that's what death turns out to bring us, Socrates would. Maybe that's going to differ depending on whether you're Socrates or somebody else, whether the continuation of your soul would be something to look forward to or not. I could actually think of a number of reasons why that might be rather frightening, actually, to think about the continuation of your soul, assuming that's the kind of thing that death is. Let's say, for example, you kind of knew that you led your life in violation of particular religious norms or strictures or sanctions, which meant that some kind of punishment was probably waiting for you, even as you know your own life to be, because, well, maybe that's just kind of what happened, you know? So that would have meant maybe you didn't live your life as you ultimately had wanted to, but given that, maybe that gives you reason to be worried about what awaits in the afterlife, right? So that seems kind of like one obvious line of objection to this here. Statement number 3 is that if nothing else, it seems to depend on fairly specific facts about, well, what happens in the life after the death of the body, and how is that based on the particular actions that the individual has led. And how sure can we be of any of that to ground any rational or irrational fear? One kind of like final thing to it, that's a kind of, if you think about what I just said, there's lots of different specific traditions in religion and just morality and just human thinking about, what happens to our soul after the death of the body, and specifically, how is that tied to your actions here in life? And putting that together, does that look good or bad? Does that look like something you should be scared of or not scared of, right? So there's a lot of specific versions of that you could get into in raising a question to number 3. Let me say, what was the other thing I wanted to look at here? I'm sorry, kind of lost the thread. Maybe that was it. There's one other kind of thing that I wanted to mention about the continuation. Here, you could kind of think of the Shelley Kagan video, that I had as a link there. You might take a look at that as giving you some ideas for either 2 or 3, but certainly maybe 3. You might have some interesting ideas to think about there. And he certainly can give you some good material to work with in terms of thinking about how to think about your own death. I said that intentionally. This is kind of what we're trying to get guidance on, is how to think about your own death. It's kind of a complicated thing to think about, right? So that'll be about it here. If you look at 1, 2, and 3, if you just kind of grant those statements, so to speak, for the sake of argument. 4, I don't know, it's kind of like pretty defensible if you do grant 1, 2, and 3. Well, maybe 4 kind of follows logically. Certainly looks like there's a decent logical basis for 4 if we grant 1, 2, and 3. That's why we want to go back and look. Well, should we really grant 1, 2, and 3? And let me close with a kind of a broad view of how to approach this idea of argument evaluation. Really, I'm just kind of looking for you to get in there and give a nice, concise, targeted argument evaluation that might just pick up on 1 or 2 of the many themes I've discussed, or other relevant themes that I might not have mentioned but are clearly there as part of what I'm describing as kind of argument evaluation. I'm trying to give you a little emulation of that here. It's the kind of things that I start thinking about when I sit down and evaluate the argument, the things I just mentioned. And there's lots more that would come up in finishing and following through those big ideas that I was mentioning. But you can see there's these many strands of argument evaluation. So go through statements 1, 2, and 3 and just ask yourself, where's a kind of assumption here that isn't quite defended or supported and needs to be? Just go through 1, 2, and 3, and with that general sense of kind of critical attention to the statement in front of you as it stands, and just get 2 or 3 responses to 1, 2, and 3 as you go down. And really, that's the basis for most of your post. Most of the thread that you post really should be just kind of coming up with what on reflection, you think are some nice, critical, logical questions, pressures, questions to be asked about the different parts of this argument. So really looking at you to kind of tinker with the details kind of thing. And then, you can pull back and kind of think about the details of the rest of the directions. But most of it is so that you just kind of go through some version, roughly, of what I did, just giving your logical analysis of these different parts of the argument. So in terms of the conclusion, you will want to ultimately, what do we think about that conclusion? Because the job of an argument is to try to convince you of its conclusion. So we can ask, well, how good of a job did this argument do of convincing me that for, it would be irrational to fear your own death, or put to your own first person formulation, would it be rational for you to fear your own death? Or you can ask yourself, irrational of me to fear my being dead. So I give a couple other little discussions down below, but I think I'll pretty much leave it there. One thing to make clear, this argument really just concerns your feelings about you, the state of you being dead. So that's your feelings about something in your future, namely your being dead. So it's not about how you should feel about other people's becoming dead, nor about how they should feel about your becoming dead, but about you and your becoming dead, which of course hasn't happened yet, but I suppose most of us think it will, so it makes sense to ask ourselves, gosh, how should I feel about that? And here's a little argument that Socrates proposes to say, well, you shouldn't feel so bad about it, or at least you shouldn't fear it. So, all right, well, that's one kind of historically pretty famous philosophical attempt to logically weave together the concepts of death and fear to this rather optimistic conclusion. All right, so I put it out there for your logical consideration.